Every great film has an even more amazing soundtrack. Do you ever wonder what your soundtrack would be if your life was a movie? I know I have. Soundtracks and scores have always captivated me, and anytime I'm listening to them, some of them become a part of me, a part of my soundtrack. Some are uplifting, some more dramatic, some provide a little comic relief, and some of my favorites reside in a minor key, which gives them a bit of an eerie or surreal feeling, and those are the ones that I feel deep, and they take me back to some of those pivotal moments in my life. Some that I'll be sharing with you tonight. The first soundtrack I ever loved was one we had when I was very little. It was, in fact, an 8-track. The Muppet movie soundtrack, circa 1979, was my favorite. And I loved all the songs on there, but there was one that always stood out. Gonzo's rendition of I'm Going to Go Back There Someday. A few of the lyrics. I've never been there, but I know the way. I'm going to go back there someday. Come and go with me. It's more fun to share. We'll both be completely at home in midair. I can remember sitting on my family room floor, listening to that music and feeling like I was flying and ready to hold on to my dreams. It was actually a song with a lot of deep meaning for a movie with a bunch of Muppets. Growing up with parents who were from North Dakota was always a segue to many stories and questions, and I could talk for hours and hours of the stories I had. And it was always worth the 15 to 18-hour drive, which was nonstop, especially when we transitioned to a van from a station wagon. Now, there were 3 of us kids, and I was always in the way back, and that was before seatbelt laws. When we go back to school, my friends and classmates would say where they spent their summers, Disney, the Grand Canyon, summer camps. I got to say, North Dakota, every year. Raised eyebrows usually followed, but honestly, they were the best 2 weeks of my summer. I actually drove for the first time on my grandparents' farm, because up there you can drive when you're 15. So my grandfather, my dad, and I drove to the pasture to go feed the cows. Now, while much of North Dakota is flat, there are also areas that have amazing hills and plunging valleys. And for a first-time driver, that was terrifying. As we climbed one of those hills, I could literally only see the sky, and my grandfather telling me to stop slowing down, and me hoping that there was a road on the other side. We successfully made it over the hill, and as we turned into the pasture, I could see the cows in the far distance. And sure enough, they knew the truck, they knew the sound of the truck, and they were now headed right for me. And in my head, I could hear my soundtrack in full blast of the ecstasy of gold from the good, the bad, and the ugly. And again, my grandfather telling me, stop slowing down. It's okay, they'll move. So I pressed on, trying not to close my eyes, praying I didn't hit a cow, and sure enough, they split like the Red Sea. Sometimes I think that might be a metaphor for my life, always cautiously heading straight in, with a voice in the back of my head telling me to never slow down. It's okay, they'll move. All in all, I've never really had a lot of problems with speaking in public. My family would often lose me at ball games because I'd wander off and I'd plop down next to a stranger and begin what I'm sure was an in-depth conversation of the meaning of life. Monty Python probably was onto something. To a parent, that can be a very scary trait for the kids to have. And as fate would have it, my daughter is the same. Her first word was hi. To be fair, she gets it honestly, as my husband is just as much of a talker as I am. Let's just say dinner conversations at the Rome household can last a while, but they're always amusing. But I wouldn't have it any other way. I officially met my husband when we came back from school to our hometowns. I say we met because of a mutual friend. He'll tell you we met at a bar. We were friends first, and after a night of talking until 3 a.m. in that same bar parking lot, we decided to become more. And it's like those movies about two people who are in the same place, brush past each other at a concert or a grocery store, but never really meet until finally the last scene. Because when we stopped and thought about it, our paths crossed many times over. And as much as I wished we had met earlier, I still believe we met at the perfect time. I won't dwell on our story too much, just that it's a beautiful storybook story. And in fact, our first dance at our wedding was from The Princess Bride, called Storybook Love. Speaking of our wedding, that was one for the storybooks as well. With most weddings, something always goes wrong. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's big. I'd like to say the only thing that went wrong was the fact that we sent a message to the DJ to not play any country or any Kenny G at the reception. That message was lost because there was a lot of country and a lot of Kenny G. But no. Instead, there was a little mix-up with the readings that we had during the ceremony. We were given a book that had a number of readings in it to choose from. Some talked about two people becoming one, love is a virtue, and many other lovely readings. There was one that just didn't seem like it belonged because it talked about fornication, or rather how you should avoid it. Why would anybody choose that for their wedding? So we went with love is a virtue. Simple, sweet, perfect. So when the time comes for the reading, my husband and I are kneeling at the front of the church as my husband's godmother recites the reading. As she begins, we both looked at each other with eyes wide, and then to the priest as he lowered his head into his hands. As we all realized this wasn't the reading about love is a virtue. This was the reading about fornication. And I might add, it doesn't just say it once. It's like 7 times. I have no idea how she kept a straight face. It's definitely one of the most memorable parts of our wedding day. Kind of a small wonder that I actually wouldn't change for the world. Again, I might have to say Monty Python had a point to always look at the bright side of life. Now, while silence for me can be an indicator that something might be wrong, as I've gotten older, I've also found the beauty in it. It's amazing what you can truly hear when you are quiet. Quiet when I practice yoga, quiet when I run, and quiet when I go bird watching. Yes, I am a proud card-carrying Audubon Society bird nerd. It's something that a lot of people don't know about me. And luckily, I have the most amazing husband who will just smile and nod when I go on and on about the different birds that I saw during that day or some other little bird factoid. And my kids find the humor when I'm mid-sentence and I stop. That's a really cool bird. So you may see me out with my binoculars, my camera, my bird books and journals, sitting quietly, listening, and watching. This might be the part in my soundtrack where you could insert any song from a Disney princess movie with wildlife. Many of you may know, some may not, that I began my long career in public health over 20 years ago, most of it being in emergency preparedness. So I got y'all. This was my perfect niche because I've always been a planner. Lists, calendars, more lists, and first aid kits everywhere. I'm pretty sure I was even able to plan my pregnancies around work projects in summertime. And I love public health. But oddly enough, you can become an unpopular person to many if you're in public health. We're constantly reminding people of the problems the community faces so we can fix them. We're telling you to exercise, eat right, be safe, wear a condom, recycle, keep that restaurant clean, and always be prepared. But before immersing myself into emergency preparedness, I was a health educator. Prevention education, to be specific. Tobacco prevention, smoking cessation classes, and my favorite, STD prevention. It actually wasn't my favorite, but it offered a lot of comic relief in the early days of my career. Again, not being afraid to speak in public is really key. And oh, the phone calls I would get prior to my presentations. Are you providing how-tos? Are you bringing bananas? No. I've had a lot of nicknames throughout my life. Toad lovingly from my father, Peck from my sister and brother, Mel B from my college friends, and during the first 5 years of my career, the sex lady. When most of your stories around work revolve around that, it's not surprising. And I suppose I should have also seen it coming when my husband said I was in charge of the talk when our kids became that age. And so when I asked our daughter how our talk compared to the one she had at school, she glared and said, "Yours had a lot more detail." I suppose the only appropriate song during this part of my soundtrack would be The Birds and the Bees. I got very used to talking about unpopular and uncomfortable topics, but to be honest, I find most of the information fascinating. If you look at my bookshelves at home, you'll find books on the plague, pandemic history, patient zeros, statistics, smallpox, influenza, and I had most of those prior to the pandemic. Throw in a few Harry Potter books and some Shel Silverstein, and there you have it. Did I mention that I like music in a minor key? It's probably starting to make sense that this part of my soundtrack starts to sound like Jaws or Psycho. That might be why I didn't mind being one of the voices some of you heard during the pandemic. When people asked my husband what I did at the health department, he would usually add the caveat, "If you know what my wife does, shit has hit the fan." Many of our lives have changed in the last few years, but I will tell you that my shoulders and my heart still bear the scars from our response to COVID. And the music during this part of my soundtrack began with sadness, moved to intensity, clarity, and finally, perseverance. Because even at the lowest of lows, I felt like where I was going was I was really able to excel and be the best of myself. Probably best described as one of my favorite songs called From Past to Present. And in a world of taboo topics, I get to say that I'm also 1 in 4. 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in a miscarriage. I'm kind of a stats person, so that's pregnancies, not women. It's not a story I've ever really shared except for to a few. In 2015, I took a pregnancy test on the 3rd of July because I was late, which wasn't always abnormal. And I honestly didn't think anything about it, and I figured it would be negative. So you can imagine my surprise when I saw a positive. And I will tell you that I panicked. And I was scared because, again, always prepared. And the questions raced. Could we afford 3 children? We just bought a vehicle that really only holds 2. I have so much going on with work. Can I reasonably take time off? Looking back, those seem like very trivial things, but it's what went through my head. It took me a couple of days, which felt like months, of being on an emotional roller coaster. But after 5 more positive tests and the complete support of my husband, I finally was able to relax, told my parents and my sister and brother, and began to get excited. Maybe I'll even do one of those big reveals that everybody does, because that really wasn't a thing when our son and daughter were born. Then, a mere 6 days after we found out, something happened that never happened before. I started to bleed. We called my in-laws, who we hadn't even had a chance to tell yet. It was our plan to have them over for dinner and surprise them with the news that weekend. So instead, we had to tell them over the phone that we were pregnant, but we needed them to come to the house to watch our kiddos so we could go to the hospital because we might be losing it. We waited in a room for the doctors and nurses, who were all very kind, but the room was cold and sterile, much like I felt. Was this my fault for freaking out at the beginning? After an ultrasound to show that yes, we were still indeed pregnant, but there wasn't much we could do but wait. Wait for the blood test and the next week to determine what our future would hold. Then it was time to go home. We got home after midnight, feeling helpless. And I wasn't sure how to feel, and I was placed back on that roller coaster. I was barely 6 weeks along, if that. And the hardest part is, do you tell people? What if it makes them uncomfortable? Do you share something you barely had? Should you be upset when you weren't sure you were ready for it in the beginning? I wanted to let my parents know, but they had just left for vacation. Do I really call them? So instead, I got up the next morning and I went to work. No one knew. We had tickets to a baseball game that night for all of us, so we went. No one knew. I didn't look any different to the people I saw that day, but inside it was painful. And I was just a woman losing her pregnancy, and no one ever really knew. Funny how that works. This woman's work. I hear that song much differently now. Losing someone is never easy, and it changes your perspective many times over. But we keep moving forward. I love that phrase, keep moving forward. It's not mine, it's actually Walt Disney's. And like in every movie, there are highs and there are lows. And the music we play during those moments allows us to feel it, creating those small wonders we'll remember forever. We get to build strength and courage from the hard parts, and we get to laugh and smile from the good ones. I hope you find small wonders wherever you go, and you embrace your soundtrack.